Today, the Midwest is seen as a good old slice of the United States. It's so American with its football and corn, so much corn, but there was a time that the Midwest was not the US. The Midwest was a foreign, distant land that wasn't settled peacefully, but had to be fought over in war. And the story for how America conquered this land from its original inhabitants begins in my home state of Ohio, and ended in my hometown. 1786. It's a strange time in North America. The United States officially won its independence. In the Treaty of Paris, the treaty that ended that war, the British ceded what they called the territory northwest of the Ohio River, along with everything east of the Mississippi. With this new land, the Americans officially formed the simplified Northwest Territory in 1787. And so the United States set people west to colonize. But there was just a tiny little issue. Other people actually lived there. Post-revolution, the Northwest Territory was inhabited by countless Native American tribes, including the Shawnee, Lenape, Potawatomi, the Miami, and a whole lot others I can't really get into. Now, this region was used to invaders. A century prior, the Iroquois Confederacy had expanded into Ohio for beaver pelts. The Iroquois were armed with something no natives in the region had saw before: firearms. As a result, they ravaged the landscape, won every battle, pushing back much smaller tribes and depopulating much of Ohio. The Council of the Three Fires, another confederacy, fought and pushed back the Iroquois, but the damage was done. Now, new invaders were on the horizon. No native tribes were invited to the Treaty of Paris, and now the United States refused to recognize their claim on Ohio. The tribes protested, but this didn't matter to the US, and colonists came in anyway. So, once again, an alliance of tribes had to be formed. Across the Great Lakes, the Potawatomi, the Miami, the Wabash, the Delaware, the Chippewa, the Shawnee, the Ottawa, the Illinois, and the Council of the Three Fires united into the Western Confederacy. The Confederacy was determined to keep the barrier between the natives and the United States at the Ohio River, and one of its most capable leaders to do so was the chief of the Miami, Little Turtle. Little Turtle used the US's non-existent military to his advantage, launching raids and attacks against the colonists. The governor of the territory, Arthur St. Clair, wrote to Washington asking for reserves to crush the rebellion. Washington agreed. The military force was to meet at a fort near Cincinnati, Ohio. The target? The native villages in what is now Indiana. An expedition of 2,000 men, led by St. Clair himself, are sent north to crush the natives. The Northwest Indian War, or Little Turtle's War, had begun. As Lieutenant Ebenezer Denny wrote, the men appear to be raw and unused to the gun or the woods. Effectively, the Americans were walking into a land they didn't know, and the results for them were catastrophic. When the Americans reached Indiana, over the next few days their numbers would fall. In the first battle, only a third of the American regulars remained, 40 militiamen were dead, and the expedition was in full retreat. Shaken by the loss, the militia began to lose hope. But it wasn't over yet. The next day, 300 Americans discovered a force of 1,000 natives. Out-strategized by Little Turtle and outnumbered, 150 more died. St. Clair's force remained in Indiana as part of the army retreated to the Ohio River. On November 3rd, before the sun came down, Little Turtle's force attacked. The militia outside the camp fled across the river. Fighting went back and forth until bayonets were fixed and men charged against the natives retreating towards the woods, only for the Americans to be surrounded and killed. This happened actually many times. Surrounded by all sides, St. Clair and all able-bodied men fled for Fort Jefferson, being chased by the natives for 3 miles. The wounded still in the camp were left behind as the natives overran, and there were no survivors taken. In the end, St. Clair's defeat was the biggest defeat the United States would ever sustain by the natives. 630, 70% of the Americans sent, were killed. For comparison, only 270 Americans died in the more famous Battle of Little Bighorn. Like I said, unlike most wars against the natives, which were often just massacres, Little Turtle's War was actually a war, and in 1791, America was losing. Shocked at the defeat, Washington decided that an organized force was needed to invade Ohio, and called on General Mad Anthony Wayne to do it. And so Anthony Wayne formed the Legion of the United States. Preparations, however, would take a bit, and 2 years later, after St. Clair's defeat, Anthony Wayne marched to Ohio. In 1793, the natives, including the Shawnee, a British delegate, and American representatives met at the Sandusky River to discuss peace terms. The British wanted Ohio to become a native state, while the Americans wanted it as a new state. These negotiations broke down as the Americans refused to resettle colonists out of Ohio, explaining it'd be too expensive. Anthony Wayne was leading his forces back to where St. Clair was defeated, forming Fort Recovery. With negotiations falling through, the professional military force began to push back the natives. By 1794, the native resistance had begun falling. The Legion was able to win small victories up the river. The Confederacy, including leaders like Blue Jacket of the Shawnee and Little Turtle of the Miami, decided to hold a last stand off the shores of a river in what is today Maumee, Ohio. A storm had toppled over a patch of trees, and this is where the natives would defend. Unlike the other times, however, they couldn't destroy the well-prepared Legion. The charge of cavalry and use of professional rifles led to a swift native defeat, and they fled upriver. The British, against the treaty a decade earlier, still had forts in the region, and the natives asked for refuge. However, not wishing for a conflict against the Americans, the British refused. The Battle of Fallen Timbers was over. The decade of native resistance against American colonization, Little Turtle's War, ended right here in my hometown. In the aftermath of the battle, with the signing of the Treaty of Greensville, a border was declared between the new Ohio Territory and the natives. For the next decade, Little Turtle's War inspired other natives to resist, including Tecumseh, who wouldn't be defeated until the War of 1812 at the Battle of the Thames. As the decades loomed on and more settlers arrived, the Northwest Territory, what we commonly know as the Midwest today, was split into new states. As the centuries went on, these regions, once at the center of a war of conquest and resistance, would simply be seen as American as apple pie. Today, you can drive down Anthony Wayne Trail, named after the route the Legion of the United States took, and visit the site of the Battle of Fallen Timbers. This is actually one of the strangest videos I've ever done because the battle is actually tied to our local history. Hell, I even went to a high school named after Anthony Wayne. Go Generals, by the way. Until I did further research on this patch of ground, I never knew the extent of its history. I didn't know Fallen Timbers was the conclusion to a far larger story. And even though it's surrounded by interstates and a mall named after the battle, I think Fallen Timbers is a good reminder of how the United States expanded. It wasn't simply settlers coming into an area. There was resistance. America had to fight a war for a decade to gain Ohio from the people who already lived there. Natives like the Miami tribe defended against it every step of the way, their main legacy now being the river and town, Maumee, named after them. This video isn't about feeling guilty. I'm a local, I didn't do anything, but I think it's important to always gain context. Context for how young America came to expand from those 13 colonies all the way back to the Pacific. That expansion had to begin somewhere, and it began in Ohio. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.